The forest was quiet that morning, wrapped in the soft silence of autumn. Golden leaves fell in lazy spirals from the branches, carpeting the ground with a thick, rustling blanket. A lone hunter moved carefully through the trees, his eyes scanning the earth for fresh tracks. The man had lived his whole life in these woods, and he knew their every secret, the hidden streams, the winding deer trails, the shadowed caves. He had set out that day searching for game, but fate had prepared something else entirely. At first, he thought the sound he heard was the wind threading its way through the trees. A long, broken cry that rose and fell like a sigh of the earth. He paused, holding his breath. Then it came again, higher, sharper, filled with such raw pain that it made his skin prickle. It was not the cry of a bird or the howl of a grown wolf. It was weaker, fragile, trembling like the voice of a child. The hunter's brow furrowed. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and followed the sound, his boots crunching softly on the leaves. Each step he took seemed to draw him deeper into the mystery. Branches clawed at his coat, and somewhere in the distance, a raven cawed, as if warning him to turn back. But he pressed on. Finally, the cries grew clearer. They were coming from a cluster of thorn bushes near a fallen log. The hunter slowed his steps, crouching low, his eyes sharp and cautious. Wolves were dangerous creatures, fierce, cunning, loyal to their packs. If a cub was near, the mother could not be far behind. Yet, when he peered through the thick brush, what he saw made him stop cold. There, nestled in the tangle of leaves and thorns, was a wolf cub. Small, frail, no more than a few weeks old. Its fur was dirty and tangled, streaked with blood from a deep gash along its hind leg. Its ribs showed through its thin coat, and its eyes, wide with fear and pain, glistened like pools of amber. The cub lifted its head weakly and let out another broken howl, a sound so filled with despair that it pierced straight through the hunter's heart. The man froze. Every instinct told him to step back, to let nature run its course. This was the law of the wild, only the strong survived, and the weak were left behind. It was not his place to interfere. He had seen it many times before. Injured fawns, abandoned birds, creatures too small to fight against the harshness of life. And yet, this was different. For a moment, man and beast simply stared at one another. The cub trembled, its breath shallow, its tiny body racked with pain. But in its eyes there was something more than fear, there was a silent plea, a fragile spark of trust, as if it understood that the figure standing before it held its only chance of survival. The hunter's hand tightened around the strap of his rifle. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. This is madness, he thought. If he carried the cub back to the village, people would not understand. They would call him a fool, perhaps even dangerous. Wolves were predators, they were not meant to live beside men. And yet, the hunter could not bring himself to turn away. Carefully, he lowered his rifle to the ground and reached into the thorns. The cub flinched, snapping its tiny teeth in a feeble attempt at defense. Its growl was pitiful, more like a whimper than a threat. Slowly, patiently, the man wrapped his coat around the trembling body, shielding it from the cold air. The cub let out one last soft howl, then sagged against his chest, too weak to resist. The hunter rose to his feet, holding the bundle close. His heart pounded, his mind torn between reason and compassion. He knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. He had stepped into a story larger than himself, a story written in the cries of a helpless cub abandoned in the heart of the forest. And as he carried the tiny creature toward his cabin, the leaves rustled in the trees above, as if the forest itself was watching. The hunter pushed open the creaking door of his cabin, the bundle in his arms stirring faintly. Inside, the air was warm from the fire he had left smoldering that morning, but to him, it felt heavier than usual. He placed his rifle against the wall and set the small form down on a pile of cloth near the hearth. The cub whimpered softly, curling into the folds of the hunter's coat, its eyes dull from exhaustion. For a long moment, the man simply stood there, staring. He felt the weight of his choice pressing down on him. To bring a wolf cub into his home was no small matter. In the village, people already whispered about him. He was a man of few words, living alone on the edge of the woods, closer to the wolves and deer than to his neighbors. They respected his skills as a hunter, but respect was not the same as trust. And now, if they discovered he had taken in a predator's child, the whispers would turn into outrage. The hunter rubbed a hand over his beard, pacing before the fire. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. His father's voice echoed in his memory, stern and unyielding, "Never forget, the wolf is our rival. Respect it, yes. Fear it, always. But never bring it into your home." He turned to look at the cub again. Its tiny chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath shallow and uneven. Its leg was badly injured, the wound raw and ugly. The hunter crouched, his eyes softening despite himself. He knew that if he returned the cub to the forest now, it would not survive the night. Hunger, cold, or other predators would claim it before dawn. Still, he hesitated. Saving it would mean responsibility. Wolves were not like dogs, they could not be tamed so easily. This cub might grow to see him as an enemy. He might raise it only for it to one day bare its fangs and vanish into the wild, leaving behind nothing but scars. The hunter leaned back on his heels, his gaze locked on the fire. He thought of the countless hunts he had been on, the deer he had tracked, the wolves he had watched from afar. He had always admired their strength, their unity, the way they fought and lived as one. And yet, here lay one of them, alone, broken, and utterly defenseless. The cub let out a faint whimper, drawing the man back from his thoughts. Its eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest second, they met his. In those amber depths, the hunter saw not a predator, not a threat, but a creature pleading for life. That look pierced him deeper than any arrow could. With a sigh, he rose to his feet. "All right, little one," he whispered, though his tone carried more resignation than conviction. He fetched a small bowl and warmed milk over the fire. He knew wolves were not meant to drink it, but it was all he had. When he held the bowl to the cub's muzzle, it resisted at first, snapping weakly at his hand. But hunger soon overpowered fear, and the cub lapped at the milk with trembling effort. The hunter worked quickly after that. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and crushed herbs he had gathered on his hunts. The cub whimpered and struggled, but he held it firmly, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. By the time he finished binding the leg with a strip of cloth, the cub had collapsed back onto the coat, exhausted but alive. The hunter sat by the fire long into the night, watching the flames dance. He knew that by helping this creature, he had crossed a line. Tomorrow, the villagers might see him differently. Some would call him foolish, others dangerous. But as he listened to the quiet breaths of the cub beside him, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, his cabin did not feel so empty. The days that followed tested both the cub's strength and the hunter's resolve. Each morning, as the first pale light crept through the cracks of the cabin walls, the hunter would rise and check on his unusual guest. At first, the cub was nothing more than a fragile shadow of life, curled up in the folds of the hunter's coat, trembling with fever. Its injured leg swelled despite the man's careful bandages, and its cries sometimes pierced the stillness of the night, waking the hunter from uneasy dreams. But the man was stubborn, and so was the little wolf. Every day, he cleaned the wound, boiled herbs, and crushed roots into pastes, applying them with hands that had once only known the work of hunting and skinning. Now, those same hands learned patience. At first, the cub fought him, snapping its small jaws, growling pitifully, its eyes wide with mistrust. The hunter bore the scratches in silence, never striking back, never giving up. Slowly, very slowly, the cub began to yield. Food was another battle. Wolves were hunters by nature, and a bowl of milk was no true meal for such a creature. The hunter began cutting small pieces of meat from his own rations, roasting them gently and offering them to the cub. At first, it refused, turning its head away. But hunger is relentless. On the third day, the cub sniffed, then cautiously nibbled. By the end of the week, it devoured every scrap the hunter set before it, licking its muzzle with surprising determination. The hunter couldn't help but smile at the sight. It had been years since he had smiled so openly. Alone in the cabin, he often felt the silence closing in on him, the loneliness pressing heavy on his chest. But now, that silence was broken by the soft patting of tiny paws, the occasional clumsy growl, or the faint sound of the cub gnawing on a scrap of wood as if it were a bone. The cabin no longer felt like a prison of solitude. It felt alive. News, however, travels quickly in small villages. One morning, as the hunter carried water from the stream, he noticed two villagers watching him from a distance. They whispered to one another, their eyes fixed on the bundle of fur poking its head out from behind his coat. By evening, the rumors had spread. "Have you heard?" Some said. "The old hunter has gone mad. He keeps a wolf in his house." Others shook their heads in disbelief. "It's dangerous." That creature will grow, and when it does, it will turn on him, or worse, on us. When the hunter came into the village for supplies, he felt their stares. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men folded their arms and muttered under their breath. Yet no one dared confront him directly, for they knew his skill with a rifle and his unyielding will. Still, their judgment weighed on him. One evening, as the cub limped across the wooden floor, clumsy yet determined, the hunter sat by the fire, lost in thought. He had always been the outsider, the man who belonged more to the forest than the village. Now, with a wolf at his side, he was drifting even further from the people he had once called neighbors. And yet, he could not regret it. The cub had begun to change. Its fur grew thicker, glossier. Its eyes, once dull with pain, now shone with a fierce light. Though still small, it moved with the restless energy of the wild, chasing shadows, pawing at the hunter's boots, even trying to mimic a howl though its voice cracked comically. For the first time, the hunter saw in it not just a helpless creature, but a companion, one who had chosen life against all odds. Late that night, as the forest howled with the cries of distant wolves, the cub sat at the hunter's feet, ears perked. It tilted its head and let out its own small, trembling howl. The sound was thin, imperfect, yet filled with defiance. The hunter listened, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. He realized then that this cub was no burden, no curse, but a reminder. A reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, life could cling, fight, and rise again. Against all odds, the cub had survived. And against all doubts, the hunter had chosen to stand beside it. The cub grew with each passing week, and so too did the bond between it and the hunter. What had once been a fragile, trembling creature now bounded across the cabin floor with youthful energy. Its leg had healed, leaving only a faint scar beneath its thickening fur. The hunter, once accustomed to silence, now found himself constantly accompanied, whether in the woods, at the riverbank, or while tending to his traps. The wolf pup followed faithfully. At first, the hunter kept a careful distance. He reminded himself daily that this was a wild creature, not a pet, and that their companionship was fragile. But the cub seemed determined to break every wall he tried to keep. It would nudge his hand with its muzzle, tug at his boots, or curl beside him by the fire at night. The hunter, against his own instincts, began to soften. He would speak to the pup in low tones as he worked, sometimes even laughing when the wolf clumsily tried to pounce on falling leaves or barked at its own reflection in the river. Still, not everyone shared his growing affection. The villagers' whispers had grown into warnings. When the hunter walked into the marketplace, carrying sacks of grain or bundles of furs, people stepped back. One man spat into the dirt and said, "Mark my words, that beast will tear his throat out one night." A woman muttered, "Wolves bring only misfortune. To feed one is to call its pack upon us." The hunter ignored them, but their words lingered in his mind. At night, when the forest was alive with distant howls, he would glance at the cub lying beside the hearth and wonder what future awaited them. Would it stay? Would it turn on him one day? Or would it hear the call of its kind and vanish into the shadows forever? One night, his fears came alive in a way he could not have imagined. The air was thick with mist, the moon a pale ghost behind drifting clouds. The cub, now nearly grown into a young wolf, paced restlessly around the cabin, its ears twitching at every sound. The hunter sensed it too. Something was different in the forest. The silence between the trees was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. Then it came, a long, haunting howl that echoed through the valley. Deep, commanding, the voice of a wolf pack. The young wolf froze, its head lifting sharply. Its eyes glowed with recognition, its body trembling with instinct. Another howl answered, and then another, until the night was alive with a chorus of voices. The hunter's heart pounded. He reached for his rifle, though he did not raise it. Slowly, he stepped to the window. Shadows moved among the trees, sleek forms circling, their eyes catching the pale light. The pack had come. The wolf beside him gave a sharp bark, then pressed its body against the hunter's leg, torn between loyalty and blood ties. When the pack howled again, it threw back its head and answered with its own cry, a strong, proud sound that echoed into the night. The hunter braced himself, expecting the worst. A pack could tear through his cabin in minutes if they chose. He gripped the rifle tighter, his eyes never leaving the shapes in the darkness. But what happened next left him stunned. The pack did not attack. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. They howled again, not in rage but in acknowledgement. The young wolf stepped forward, pressing its muzzle against the hunter's hand as if to say, "I am theirs, and I am yours." The hunter lowered his rifle, his breath catching in his chest. The wolves turned, one by one, vanishing silently back into the forest. The young wolf remained at his side, its amber eyes watching him with unshakable loyalty. That night, the hunter understood something he had never believed possible. By saving the cub, he had not only earned its trust but also the respect of the wild itself. From that moment on, the bond between man and wolf was no longer one of chance, but of destiny. Seasons shifted, and with them, the cub grew into a strong, magnificent wolf. Its once fragile body was now sleek and powerful, muscles rippling beneath its silver-gray coat. Its eyes glowed with intelligence and pride, yet they still softened when they turned toward the man who had saved its life. For the hunter, those months had been unlike any other in his long, solitary existence. He was no longer just a man living in the wilderness, he was a man with a companion who filled his silent world with purpose. Together, they roamed the forest. The hunter would check his traps while the wolf padded silently at his side, alert to every sound. Sometimes, when the man paused to drink from a stream, he would catch the wolf staring at him with that same strange understanding, as though the creature could read his very soul. Their bond was not one of words but of trust, born in the darkest of nights and tested through countless trials. But as the wolf matured, the hunter knew deep down that the wild would call to it sooner or later. He noticed it in small moments, the way the wolf's ears perked at distant howls, the way its body tensed at the scent of other packs. Though it always returned to his side, there was a restlessness in its gaze, a yearning he could never replace. The villagers, meanwhile, never stopped whispering. Some said the hunter had bewitched the beast, others swore it was only a matter of time before the wolf turned savage. Yet none could deny the strange peace that had settled in the woods. Where once livestock had been attacked and hunters had lost hounds, there was now quiet. Wolves no longer came near the village. It was as if the pack itself respected the boundary marked by the hunter's cabin. One evening, as winter loosened its grip and spring returned to the forest, the hunter sat on his porch with the wolf at his feet. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The man stroked the animal's thick fur, feeling the steady strength beneath it. A heaviness pressed on his heart. He knew what must come next. "You're not meant to stay here forever," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You belong to the forest, to your kind." The wolf lifted its head, meeting his gaze. For a long moment, it seemed to understand. Then, as if sensing the man's unspoken decision, it rose to its feet and trotted to the edge of the clearing. There it paused, looking back, its amber eyes reflecting both sorrow and gratitude. The hunter stood, every muscle aching with the weight of farewell. With a steady breath, he opened the cabin door wide, a silent gesture of release. The wolf hesitated only a moment longer before disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the shadows of the forest it was born to rule. The cabin felt unbearably empty that night. The hunter sat by the fire, listening to the silence he had once grown used to but now found unbearable. Yet, just as grief began to overtake him, a sound rose in the distance, a howl, strong and clear, echoing through the valley. It was the wolf, his wolf. Tears burned the man's eyes as he listened. It was not a cry of sorrow but of remembrance, a promise that their bond would never be broken. From that night onward, whenever the hunter ventured deep into the woods, he would hear that familiar call. Sometimes, he even caught glimpses of the wolf in the distance, watching from the ridge of a hill or the shadows of the trees, never too far, never fully gone. The villagers eventually stopped whispering. Some even began to say that the hunter had made peace with the wild, that the forest itself had accepted him as one of its own. But the truth was far simpler. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had gained a friend who would forever carry his memory into the heart of the wilderness. And so, the legacy of that howl lived on, not as a warning, but as a song of loyalty, echoing through the forest, binding man and wolf for all time.